Hello guys, it is Chris back here again in the thick of it with some Magic the Gathering. Today we're actually going to be playing something a little different. We'll be playing Best of 3, which is the bog standard for Paper Magic format. We will be playing Standard, and we will be playing with the Sultai Ultimatum deck. Sultai Ultimatum has been running around in the meta for a while. It was the top deck there for a month or two. I don't know if it still is, because I haven't been over to MTG Goldfish lately, but that's the deck we're playing for our first best of 3 game. This is the kind of deck that I kind of like playing in Standard and best of 3. Your dirtily control decks where you're basically trying to win with... we'll still win with creatures sometimes, because Vorinclex is in the deck, but it's more combo-y / synergistic in that you get a Planeswalker or something down, you outvalue your opponent to the point where they just can't get back into the game. And Sultai Ultimatum is one of the decks in Standard that really does that well at the moment. Looks like our first matchup of the day is actually, we'll only be playing one matchup today against our friend Aragon999. Don't actually know who that is, but Aragon, Lord of the Rings reference, can't be a bad person. Although they are playing rogues, which is generally when I look for signs of who is and who is not a bad person, I look for whether or not they're playing rogues. So we get down to Wolf Willowhaven. There's probably somebody out there that says the same thing about the Sultai Ultimatum deck, to be honest. Just depends on your preferred flavor for at least tiered Standard decks. I played rogues for a little while too, back when it was at the top of the meta. It was a fun deck. I played a slightly jankier version with, because I was playing somewhere between the Locus, Locus of Creation? Omnus Locus of Creation, somewhere after his ban, and somewhat before his ban. Because I played that deck too in Standard, and it was just really fun. It wasn't fun to play against, but it felt really good to play. But here we're just waiting. We have a Cling to Dust in hand. Really good for us. Which, the reason it's really good is because it can actually exile our own yard, if necessary. So let's say we cast a 3-mana spell with a black mana open, and our opponent tries to drown in the lock our 3-mana spell. If we Cling to Dust while the Drown in the Lock is on the stack, it actually will fizzle the counter because they no longer have the needed cards in graveyard to pull off the condition for the counter spell. We ended up using it on our turn, on the end of their turn though, just to get some incremental value out of it. It's always good to have, it's actually a deceptively good card. Like, initially when I saw decks running it, I thought, there's no way I want to put this in my deck. There's got to be something better, but against rogues in particular, it's really good. Because you can exile 6 cards from your library. And part of the strategy that rogues go for is their mill plan, which they can still mill you out even if you exile cards from your graveyard, but they don't get the fringe benefits that they would off of things like the Skilled Enforcer and their Dimir 1/3 Lord creature. They Heartless Act our Cultivator. That means they can start getting in damage. 1 damage a turn, though, is not going to get the job done. It doesn't really matter too much what our opponent does in that regard, because in 17 turns, we will have the necessary conditions to force through our Emergent Ultimatum. They can't get around that. I'm going to actually cast Vorinclex here. I could cast Ultimatum, but I think they have a counterspell. At least with casting Vorinclex, we can Mystical Dispute if they get a counter off of us. Which Means at the very least we can get in for 6 damage. That'll mean we have a bigger clock than they do. They'll have to respond to it on their turn. Well, they won't have to respond to it on their turn, but they'll have to respond to it in such a way that it gives us a window to actually do something else. So this may actually clear the way for Ultimatum in the next few turns. We dispute their disdainful stroke. Vorinclex comes down, deals 6. We are technically ahead in the race at the moment, although I can't imagine Vorinclex surviving until our next turn. He's one of the things they have to answer. Yeah, there goes the Drowning Lock, which gets a counterspell out of their hand, which is very useful for us. I think next turn, we'll probably put off our Emergent Ultimatum for another turn, because we can, with the Heartless Act in hand that we do actually, we can Cling to Dust and Heartless Act on their turn. It's just a matter of whether or not they actually have a way to stop Emergent Ultimatum, because as it stands, our hand will not do anything without Emergent Ultimatum. I haven't played this matchup in a while, so I'm still a little rusty at some of the mechanics in it. But this first game, I feel like I did pretty well despite my initial misgivings against facing another Tier 1 deck. At the end of the turn, I Cling to Dust. Get rid of my graveyard. One of the weird things I learned in this match is that if you have 5 cards in your exile zone, you can actually still target a card in your exile zone that's going to get exiled with the escape. And because of how Cling to Dust is worded, it actually fizzles. It fizzles your the draw trigger off the Cling to Dust, because it says if another type of card was exiled this way, draw a card. But if you don't actually exile any card, it doesn't trigger, which is a little disappointing. But you live and you learn in these type of situations. So a Hedron Crowd comes down. Then our opponent puts down a Lurrus, and then they get their Thieves Guild Enforcer. So they tapped out to push this board state onto the field. We're going to actually take the opportunity to just get off the Shadow's Verdict. When Sim tap down, there generally won't be a better alternative to actually get that off. So we draw our Velki. Normally in these types of Sultai Ultimatum decks, you can't actually cast a Velki. You can for its 2-drop cost, but you can't really cast it for its 5-drop cost without Emergent Ultimatum. We actually can cast it for its 7 mana cost because of World Tree. So we get Professor Onyx, the Epiphany, and Cure Best of Sea God. Seagate Restoration. Pretty decent options. We can draw, I think, 4? Maybe 5. It may say +1. I think it does. Because otherwise it would just be pretty bad, right? It's already not that great, but when you have it as a land, it's not too bad. Opponent gave us the Restoration and the Epiphany. We didn't draw too much good stuff, but we're also not in bad shape. Yeah, it looks like it is a draw 5 because it's the number of cards you have in hand +1. Opponent thinking of their options, whether or not a bird is worth killing. Probably not. we cast Tybalt Cosmic Imposter. And with his +2, we draw 2 cards off of each library. Well, 2 cards in total, 1 off each library. So we got a Omen and a of One Mind. That's a decent card draw. Attacking with our bird, our opponent enters the stories. That's actually a little intimidating. Them having 4 extra cards means they'll probably have more counterspells. It's just a matter of whether or not they can actually get over the Tybalt, which I don't think they can. They eliminate a bird. Thinking over their options. They eliminate another bird. Don't know what our opponent has against birds. Probably because they're the only clock on the board, but... We exile 2 more cards. We drew our second Eldritch Epiphany. Aldridge? I think it's Aldridge. I keep on calling him Eldridge. Which is not right, but... just a little quirk of the job. We get our 2 birds. We play our opponent's Merfolk Windrobber. I was wondering how we got that. But yeah, that's a Tybalt card. And then we pass to our second turn. Here we can -8, get 3 mana, and then have all of the cards in exile thanks to Tybalt. It means we have counterspells for days, card draw for days, lands, a whole bunch of everything. And our opponent scoops it up. Now we go into the sideboarding phase of the game. Here, I probably don't make the right choices, at least not initially. I'd say Pelucranosis probably should have came in here. With our opponent's self-mill plan, I think my initial thought pattern of using Cling to Dust escape shenanigans to shut off their Lord effects was probably along the right lines, but we sideboarded how we sideboarded in this match, and gonna have to see it through. I don't know, I was thinking that with counterspells, I was thinking more from a combo player perspective as opposed to a matchup perspective, and in that scenario, it made sense to bring in the counterspells, because I thought to myself, Emergent Ultimatum in this matchup will probably never be cast on 7, because our opponent is probably going to be sitting on 1 or 2 blue mana when I am on my 6th land. So that way, when they pass it over to me and I play my 7th, they'll have insurance up to make sure that Emergent Ultimatum doesn't go through, because Emergent Ultimatum is pretty much the win condition of the deck, and a lot of the time, if it's cast, it's a non-recoverable situation for the opponent. And I've definitely played games where opponent has cast an Emergent Ultimatum, and I've even played games where opponents have cast 2 Emergent Ultimatums and survived, but it wasn't some brilliant deck plan strategy. It was more the big hit came down, and I was lucky enough to get answers, while my opponent was unlucky enough not to draw any kind of follow-up. That's the kind of situation you get yourself in when you're under an ultimatum. We actually drew a Triome here, which is a really good pickup for our first draw of the game. It allows us to play the Omen of the Sea on turn 2, which is pretty decent. The card draw will be nice. Can always rely on a Thief's Guild Enforcer on turn 1, or turn 2, in this case, because they also had a Triome. It's a really good card, despite how deceptive it looks. But I guess that fits the whole rogue shtick, doesn't it? Opponent thinking over their options. 2 mana. What are they gonna do? They play another blue source. Not really what I want to see against my rogue's opponent. Holding up a lot of blue, that means counter spells. Holding up a lot of black, that means removal. But three blue sources, that represents pretty bad times. We get down our Omen of the Sea. Our opponent correctly decides not to counter it. Although they could have. It would have been nice of them. We switch over to our turn. We try to get down an Elspeth Conquers Death. Brought an Elspeth Conquers Death because I thought it was one of the effects that was symmetrical in Graveyard Exile. Actually not, which is a little disappointing. It's still a good enough card to have in the sideboard, and to bring it in these type of matchups because it does give you some hand disruption, and it will remove one of your rogues that are trying to kill you, but it looks as though our opponent actually has an answer for it, which is a little bit unfortunate. Yep, didn't say please. There's a double blue coming through for you. That's triple blue because Zagos Triome is technically a blue source. Although, to be real, it's mainly a multicolor land. For this matchup. The reason why it's in the deck is because it's a blue-black source. And it has cycling in case it gets stranded. Opponent thinking over their options. They see that we have also achieved all the mana we need. Although I definitely would like more green sources. Need at least one more green source. So we get on our second blue source. Part of the piloting of this deck really does rely on how well you can pilot the deck as far as mana sources go, because if you play a land and you actually don't need that color later on, it'll hurt you. This is the part that I was talking about earlier, where I accidentally target a card in my own library that is already going to be exiled by the escape effect, so I don't actually get a card draw off of it. It's a little disappointing, but in the circumstances, it was to be expected, really. So Shadow's Verdict is one of our possible outs to this scenario. Opponent's considering how much they need to commit to get me to start acting. I can imagine with what they're displaying at the moment, they likely have a Drown in the Loch, which is why they were going for all that extra mill. That many cards in the library, in our graveyard, we can actually go for an ultimatum. Here I put the pathway on blue. In retrospect, it might not have been the right decision. I believe this is a match where later on I'm going to end up drawing another island. And in that scenario, that was my land drop for turn. So we actually drew Eliminate here, that's good. Yeah, it's one of the weird things about the deck where you only really want 3 green sources, which means when you end up with a lot of blue and black lands, it becomes a little bit hard to figure out which way you should put down your pathways. I think the pathways are really good in the deck, but there's definitely a higher margin for error than there would be for something like shock lands or check lands. So we ended up dying there to the attack. That was unfortunate. Must not have been the game I was thinking about. So here we take a little bit of time to think over our choices. We end up putting in the Pelugrinoses. We actually didn't take out the counter spells, which is a little questionable, but I guess it won't hurt us too bad. So we're gonna play first. We decided to keep a risky hand. Probably shouldn't have, to be honest. Get down a swamp. Cling to Dust is the real reason why this hand is anywhere near keepable. Because in theory, it gives us an extra draw to find another mana source. We drew an Emergent Ultimatum. That's not a mana source, so we have to pass a turn. Opponent gets down there. Third, turn 1, turn 2, Thief's Guild Enforcer, which we were relying on, so I can't complain too much. We drew a Pelucranos Unchained. That's actually something we would have preferred to see them mill, as opposed to our Professor Onyx. That's one of our win conditions. Getting a Professor Onyx down early, really good for the game. Our opponent plays a Wind Robber, attacks in for 1, passes the turn. We drew a second Emergent Ultimatum, so we have to pass again with 1 land. At least we have the Pelucranos to actually drop here as our discard, because we do have 8 cards in hand. And that means we can still cast it later. So it's not as big of a loss. Almost wish we had decided to... No, we definitely should have decided to mulligan this hand. Something to think about for later. So our opponent, they're attacking in for 9 to turn? Dead in 2? We get our Triumph, but it might be just a little bit too late. Like, if they play, like, a Lord at the end... Well, they didn't play a Lord at the end, so... We still get our 2 turns. Oh, they're actually only attacking in for 7. Still dead in 2 turns, but... We did not draw a 3rd land. That's a game for us. We pass it over to our opponent. Let them do their thing. Discard our Elspeth's Nightmare. Opponent's going to try to test the waters and attack in. And that's the match. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye for now.